That's it. How are you all? Excellent. You feeling good? Fit and healthy? Is that because of you? There you go. See, it's one thing to actually feel good. That's it. But realistically, as humans, basically, we want to be mentally well. We want to be physically well. And let's face it, there's a lot of different pressures around the world, basically, that are certainly testing our mental sort of wellness. Let's face it. So, my name's Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute. So we're a global futures and deep futures advisory organization working up to 50 years out. So I work with governments, I work with multinational organizations in 100 different countries. And in this particular presentation, what I really want to try to sort of bring home to you are a couple of different things. So firstly, we're going to be having a look at the industry from a global perspective. So we're going to be having a look at all of the trends that affect you, your profession, your companies, your countries, from a direct and or indirect perspective. Then we're going to be having a look at the future of healthcare. Then we're going to be having a look at some of the challenges that you face in the future, bearing in mind that every challenge is actually an opportunity. And then we're going to be having a look at some of the skills, basically, that you actually need to navigate what is increasingly a complex future. Now, as humans, I think it's probably fair to say that we can all get our heads around one thing. The only issue is that today, when we talk about the one thing that's changing, it just happens to be everything. And everything is changing, whether you have a look at how society is changing, technology is changing, politics is changing, the economy is changing, the environment is changing. Getting our heads around some of these changes is not necessarily difficult under normal circumstances. But these changes are happening faster and faster, and they are multi-layered. And that's what's causing us issues, whether that's at an individual, professional, company, or government level. In the 1970s, the United States military coined the phrase VUCA, which we all know: volatile, uncertain, chaotic, not complex any longer. A lot of the American companies that I work with say it's chaotic, and we say yes. I don't know whose fault that is. And then the future is ambiguous. But increasingly, we have this MAX acronym because the changes that we are seeing are massive. They are system level. If you have a look at how politics is changing, technology is changing, we're talking about global level changes. Everything is accelerating. You'll have seen this, for example, with artificial intelligence, let alone politics again, let alone how the economies are changing at speed. And then the changes are exponential. Now, we often talk about exponential technology. As a futurist, I have to mention exponential technology. It's kind of like my tradecraft. But increasingly, we're dealing with exponential rates of change. So, to give you an example, when ChatGPT 5 was released, it took a whole 67 milliseconds to be used on the other side of the planet. So increasingly, we have 4.5 billion connected people. We have technologies that connect us all. And if I do something here, and if I know how to execute correctly, I can proliferate changes on the other side of the planet in under a second. So I can change the global status quo. I can change your opinions, your beliefs, your ideologies. So change is no longer just at a digital rate. Increasingly, as artificial intelligence starts doing different things, which we'll get into, the rate of change is no longer digital. It's artificial intelligence on steroids. Now, when we have a look at clinical trials, annually, around the world, we try to run about 70 to 80,000 clinical trials. but only 25,000 of those actually happen. Now, if you think about technology as a multiplier, where technology is reducing the cost of resourcing, it's reducing the skills that are needed, and it's enabling us to do new things faster and cheaper than ever before, then at what point as an industry do all those trials that didn't happen because they were too complex, too difficult, too costly take place? So change number one, there will be more clinical trials in the future because they get cheaper, easier, and faster. But there are caveats associated with that. And then we estimate that the clinical trial market is worth about $85 billion. That was in 2024, and we're seeing moderate growth. But as artificial intelligence starts biting, that growth could actually start accelerating. Part of the reason for that is because there are still diseases and problems to solve. Now, when we have a look at the general cost of most clinical trials, a phase 3, the upper cost, will be about $100 million. So $20 million to $100 million. When we have a look at phase 2, it's sort of $7 to $20 million. And then when we have a look at phase 1, roughly those trials cost about $5 million. Technology will start changing the economics of trials. Now, when we start thinking about the different mega trends that are going to be shaping the market, both now and increasingly so in the future, there are lots. So from an economic perspective, we keep seeing a biotech boom. So since 2020, basically we've seen over $150 billion invested in biotech innovation. That's been increasing at a moderate pace. But from an investment perspective, we're starting to see more AI startups that are actually being funded, as well as biotechs. So this number is actually underreported. When we think about generics and IP, in 2024, we saw over 3.5 million new patent applications. Now that's a 5% year-on-year growth. Now when we think about patents and IP, we're actually seeing more patent applications year on year, especially coming from Southeast Asia. Now it's estimated, sort of back of the fag packet calculation, excuse the French, that the patent applications that went through last year are worth anywhere between $1 to $1.5 trillion basically for the industry. But by 2030, there's a patent cliff on others, and the industry basically will take a $350 billion sheep dip. So even though there's a lot of talk about generics and IP rights and so on and so forth, there's roughly a net gain of around $700 billion to $1.2 trillion for the industry. There's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of money in the game. Other problems that we actually have, both in developed and developing nations, is that every year we're spending around $9 trillion, or about 11% of GDP, on healthcare. $5 trillion of that is spent here in the United States. 18% of US GDP now goes on healthcare. And sometimes the results and the outputs don't necessarily follow, especially when we start looking at life expectancies and so on and so forth. So one of the biggest problems that governments around the world are trying to grapple with is healthcare. The process and the behavior of actually looking after your own citizens is getting more expensive and more costly. And that's without factoring in pandemics. So we need to be very, very careful that healthcare remains affordable and doesn't start being out of the reach of many people, as we are increasingly seeing. When we think about tariffs, we have primary, secondary, and tertiary tariffs. We have sector-related tariffs. So with President Trump, basically we've actually seen tariffs now being put on the European pharmaceutical industry for imports, basically of 100%. Anything over 50% starts equating to an embargo. However, from a clinical trial perspective, when you start adding together the cost of tariffs on inputs for trials, it's increasing the cost of trials roughly by about 20%. So now if you think about a phase 3 trial that's already costing $100 million, and you break down the inputs in different ways, of course. But if trials become more expensive, then ultimately you're going to do fewer of them. You're going to have to pick. And so this is something that we need to reverse. When we think about environmental trends, we saw the Nagoya Protocol basically with the United Nations, because it was far too often the case that researchers would go to a jungle, a coral reef in some lonely part of the world, find something interesting, take it back to the United States, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, wherever it happened to be, draw something from it, and then the country where that natural resource proliferates doesn't see any benefit. So increasingly, we're kind of talking about equity in research and equity in results. Now, when we have a look at, for example, deforestation, when we have a look at the desertification of the planet, 60% of the planet's surface is now degraded. We know, whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, that increasingly humans are coming into contact with species that we're not really supposed to come into contact with. So post-COVID-19, research generally estimates that the likelihood of pandemics has now tripled. And in Africa, we have researchers that are busy looking in caves and so on and so forth for disease X. So the health of our planet matters just as much as the health of our societies. And as we start seeing our planet degrade, 15 million people are dying from pollution-related causes. And when we look at things like heat stress and so on and so forth, 3.5 billion people are affected. So what's happening to the planet is actually increasingly making people sick in different parts of the world. If we think about Delhi, for example, giant landfill fires basically are causing chronic illnesses and all kinds of different things. So we need to look after each other. We need to look after our planet. Because whichever side of the political fence you sit, everyone needs clean air and everyone needs clean water. Now, when we think about geopolitics, geopolitics generally shapes quite a lot of how we live and what we do today, whether we appreciate it or not, like it or not. It's a fact of nature, shall we say. When we think about compliance, in heavily regulated industry, typically, most companies are spending around 10% of their revenues on compliance needs. And when we think about trials, we see a lot of regulations changing. So when you have a look at Reuters, when you have a look at the ISRI index, last year there were around 670,000 changes to existing regulations outside of new regulations that were coming through. So when we think about clinical trials, 76% of clinical trials have had to have protocol amendments. So that slows you down. It makes it more complex. And it's good to know that we've got the regulators in the room. Because at a lot of events, basically where I talk, they sort of leave chairs out and they say, who should, we're doing all this amazing innovative stuff, who should be in the empty chair? And everyone always says, the regulator. The way that we speed up regulation is you bring the regulators into your communities, and as you're innovating, as you're doing new things, trying to solve problems, you have the regulators looking over your shoulder. And you tell them what you're doing, why you're doing it. And they can provide you with feedback and say, if you do it like this, we're likely going to say no. But if you do it like this and modify it, we'll probably say yes. So you have to be working hand in glove with the regulators, because the regulators that I work with globally actually want to be part of the conversations. They don't want to be the bottlenecks. And when we think about brain drains, there was an article in Nature last year. So Nature went to 1,200 scientists in the United States. And 74% of them are considering leaving. Now, considering leaving is very different to actually leaving, let's face it, and the actual number that leaves is actually much lower. But when we actually think about this from a United States perspective, this is actually a problem. And it's something that Europe is capitalizing on. President Macron, a little while ago, basically said, we welcome all scientists coming to Europe. Brain drains affect trials, affect innovation, and they are not a good thing for global GDP, global or country-based GDP. And when we think about all of the STEM students that are actually trained in the United States, which there are about 105,000, 69% of them don't stay in the United States. They then leave. So when you think about the opportunity for brain drains, it's significant. And as individuals, as organizations, irrespective of the reasons basically for these numbers, I would encourage you to think, how do you actually retain your talent, but also how do you grow your talent? Appreciation is the first good step, because you're doing important work. Now, when we have a look at the FDA here in the United States, the FDA, basically to its credit, is actually starting to put together fast-track approval processes. We've seen that, especially for artificial intelligence-developed drugs. And so we've seen approval times being cut by 15 to 21 months. This is obviously over the course of a whole trial, which, bearing in mind, those can take 7 to 12 years. And 44% of novel drugs, of which basically there were 50 that were put through the FDA last year, 44% of those are actually being fast-tracked. So when I say that the regulators actually want to work with the industry, the fact that you're actually here today, wherever you are, shows the willingness. Now, when we think about geopolitics sort of more at a macro level, there is fracturing. We can pretend that there isn't. We can sit in our glass bubbles and so on and so forth, but there is fracturing. As I say, I work across 100 countries. I work with 77 governments. I'm the individual basically that sits in the back office with different world leaders, as I was on Monday and Tuesday at the United Nations General Assembly this week, and I hear kind of what they're really thinking. As China, EU, and US competition intensifies for a whole variety of different reasons, we're seeing parallel regulatory regimes and trial silos popping up, which makes running multi-country or international trials increasingly difficult and complex. It's a pain in the butt. When we think about societal trends, data privacy and ethics. Increasingly, as an industry, in order to do what you do best, you are data-driven. And the more data you have, the better. So we see genomics data, we see EHR data, and all this sort of stuff. But increasingly, more and more countries are protecting their data sovereignty. So we see data that has to be kept here, not here. We see data that can't be shared. We see sensitive genomics data, basically, with lots of different conversations happening all over the world on who owns what, how can you actually IP it, and all that kind of stuff. And so as we move into the future, data ethics, data privacy conversations, let alone the IT and ICT technologies that you need to support all of these different capabilities, are getting more complex. In many countries, basically, we're seeing what we call demographic inversion. Many countries, Europe, US, China, the populations are aging, and increasingly, older people are a greater percentage of those populations, which means that from a clinical trial perspective, the trials that come across your desks are probably going to change a little bit, shift in their focus to things like cardiovascular, diabetes, oncology, and neurological trials. So all of these things basically affect you directly and or indirectly. They tug you in one way or another. We have misinformation ecosystems. We've seen this. I've seen this week. You mention the word science in particular areas, and you can see the look on people's faces. I'm a scientist myself by background, so it's fairly painful. In recent polls by companies like Pew, Ipsos, all those kinds of organizations, increasingly 24% of Americans have little or no trust in science. That is a problem, especially if you're in the science community. And these misinformation echo chambers are getting louder and louder. But one way that you can actually push back against this is you have your own voice. You control your own narrative. You push back. Echo chambers are easy to break if you insert yourselves into conversations, into negative conversations as an industry. What we've managed to do is when people with extreme views are not challenged, those extreme views proliferate. But when people with alternative views insert themselves in those conversations on social media or wherever it happens to take place, podcasts, etc., people's extreme views soften. You can break echo chambers if you get involved in those echo chambers, because we have done it. And then when we have a look at technology, oof. So firstly, as more of us wear wearables, sensors on our bodies, etc., there's a huge amount of ambient biodata that's being collected. Even when we think about the cameras in this room, using artificial intelligence, and whether it's the camera on your phone, whether it's the cameras in this room, I could use artificial intelligence to very, very quickly do a health check on all of you. I could tell basically whether you have mental illnesses, whether you are depressed. I could tell you what your emotions are. I could tell you what your heart rates are, your blood pressure are. I could tell you if you're suffering from pancreatic cancer, if you've got the onset of Alzheimer's or PTSD. So increasingly, basically, when we think about the power of technology, both online and what we think of as offline, for example, in the smart city, with cameras positioned in the right places, you could get a very, very fast snapshot of the health of your entire city. And then you could make interventions. And then when we think about AI, did you know that ChatGPT, that thing you use, has a measured verbal, bless you, IQ of 155? Google Gemini 2.5 has an IQ of 136. You are already using large language models, basically, that have IQs that are 30 to 50% higher than the global human average, that essentially are the equivalent of Einstein's. However, ChatGPT, bless you again, here we go. You need some drugs. Okay. They're available after the session. I'm sure there's a stand somewhere that's got some drugs, right? That's it. We like that kind of conference. Well, it's a bit different in New York. Yeah. So anyway, ChatGPT has 1,000 times more general knowledge than any human. 1,000 times. Which means that you have access to an AI that has a IQ of 155 that can be applied to 1,000 different domains. When we have a look at Grok 4, when we have a look at GPT-5, they are now measured at post-PhD intelligence levels. And when we look at AGI, which is sort of 2027, 2028, depending how you define it, we estimate that AGI will have an IQ of 1,600 and will have 1 billion times more cross-domain knowledge than any human. So artificial intelligence, the large foundational models, are revolutionary. But you have to be very cautious because it's how you use them that matters. And I'll come on to that later. So as Demis, the recent Nobel Prize winner, said, solve intelligence, and then you solve everything else. We're getting closer to these points. A good example of that basically is the 50-year biology challenge. Protein folding with AlphaFold. When DeepMind basically was trying to actually create a protein folding system, and when they eventually did, they made the decision to simulate all 2.2 million proteins and put them out there for everybody to use, which is a huge contribution. But increasingly, artificial intelligence is being used to do protein folding and molecular simulation and drug simulation and everything else. But if you ever see Sam Altman being interviewed by like the Wall Street Journal, it's always quite comical, because you'll see a reporter saying, "So Sam, you've developed these artificial intelligences and they're amazing, they're really great, but what about the impact of these on human jobs? Will they just automate everybody?" And he goes, "Thank you very much, basically, for asking the question. Thank you very much for asking the question. Yes, we will be able to automate science." And the journalist goes, no, I asked you about the future of work and the workforce and everything else. And Sam goes, "Yes, I'm very, very excited about the scientific breakthroughs that our AIs will make." And they go, "No, we asked you about jobs." And he goes, "Yes, I know, I've answered that." So when you have a look at the large foundational labs, increasingly, the grand challenge for them, the thing that they want to really solve, if we want to put it in those words, is the use of artificial intelligence for pure, unadulterated, novel, scientific discovery. And in Japan, we are starting to see the first autonomous robo-scientists actually coming through, because we're trying to automate the scientific method. But that is an accelerator. It doesn't automate, it amplifies. So we have to be very careful about the language that we actually use. The future is a mindset. You can either think that artificial intelligence is the tractor that's going to replace you, or you can be the individual that sees the tractor and thinks, how do I become the CEO of John Deere? Now, to do that, you'd obviously have to swap professions. You couldn't be in clinical trials any longer. You'd have to be in the agricultural space, and that job is already taken. But you kind of get the point. Other things, basically, that we have to consider. 1 year ago, we saw the first fully autonomous agentic cyber weapon systems. So these are AIs that are able to develop malware, develop exploits, chain together zero-day attacks, and attack you autonomously. And with the university that I work with, basically, to create these, we hacked through military-grade systems 56% of the time in 2 minutes. Increasingly, your industry and the healthcare industry at large has a ransomware and a cyber epidemic. And we saw this during COVID, basically, where a lot of labs basically were being continuously attacked, especially in the UK, because people wanted to exfiltrate the IP and the research and everything else. Cyber criminals have some insanely powerful tools at their disposal now. So if you aren't thinking about the security of your organizations, your systems, and your data, you need to be doing that now. When we think about digital therapeutics, we saw the FDA approve Reset-O. This is where increasingly, for example, in this case, rather than using opioids, we kind of want you to use an app. So we see the development of telehealth, telepsychiatry, and everything else, but this is quite an interesting area, because what would be the impact if increasingly, rather than treating people with drugs, we could actually treat people with software? Now, that's possible in some cases. In other areas, it's not. However, how many of you are doing clinical trials that are just in digital therapeutics? There's no, shall we say, physical drug produced at the end. As artificial intelligence gets more powerful, as what it can do gets better, as its capabilities improve, as we see technologies like virtual reality coming through and so on and so forth, at what point do you start seeing more digital therapeutic trials? Because actually, some of the results have been really good. Just think about the calming app, basically, that you use. That means that you don't have to take certain prescription drugs, basically, for anxiety. Quantum computing. Every conference you go to, everyone will be talking about artificial intelligence. AI, artificial general intelligence. We are very, very close to quantum artificial intelligence. Quantum AI is fundamentally different to something like ChatGPT, basically all the AIs that you use within your business. And frankly, no one really knows what the actual impact of quantum artificial intelligence basically on any industry really will be. But quantum computers basically are computing systems that are able to calculate very complex problems that would have taken traditional supercomputers around 3.5 billion years in 30 seconds. So what happens when you have that kind of power in an optimized computing platform coupled with increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence? Do you know? Are you ready for that? Have you thought about it? Have you got a red team on it? Some of you will, some of you won't. But quantum computing, which really starts becoming useful in 2027, 2028, that is a fundamental step change for your industry. If anything, the impact of quantum computing will certainly rival the impact of artificial intelligence. So now you have two game-changing technologies at your doorstep. Now, when we think about the future of healthcare, increasingly consumers are getting used to the concept of healthcare on demand. I feel ill, I want a doctor on the end of the phone. Or I want a digital human or a bot on the end of the phone. More and more people are using ChatGPT, for example, to try to diagnose their illnesses now than Google. And increasingly, it's kind of getting some good things right. But also, when we talk about quantitative healthcare and predictive healthcare, by using artificial intelligence, different tools, different technologies, could we end sick care? If you think about the American healthcare system, or any other healthcare system, the name of the industry is wrong. The American healthcare system is not a healthcare system. You get ill. You break a leg, you have a heart attack, basically you get a cold, whatever it happens to be. You get sick. Then you go to the doctors. It is a sick care system. So if we can start moving to more predictive health, basically where platforms like this, for example, would identify that my baseline has changed, my baseline temperature is changing, that my galvanic sweat response is changing and everything else, and it predicts that in 2 weeks' time I'm going to get ill, then we can make interventions early. So predictive healthcare systems might actually help us start seeing the end of sick care because you don't get sick. These different technologies that are taking biomarker and biometric information from us almost constantly now, increasingly will have enough information on us to understand when something is changing in our bodies. In the United States, we managed to sequence an entire human genome, 14 of them, in 5 hours for $100. That fundamentally changes how we think about predictive healthcare, but also personal medicines. With different biotech, life science, and pharma companies around the world, we are now able to genetically engineer your gut microbiome so that it makes Parkinson's drugs, for example, in your body. These are called living pharmacies. Organizations like DARPA in the United States, the US bleeding edge research arm, are increasingly looking at how you turn a human body into the drug factory that your body needs. Using CRISPR genetic engineering technology, we've also managed to genetically engineer human liver cells and turn them into dual-core computers. So increasingly, we have the technology to turn your body into the equivalent of a human supercomputer that identifies pathogens within your body, analyzes them, and then starts creating the drugs that you need to combat that pathogen within your body. And of course, as all regulators basically will know, regulators will just go, what the hell's that? We have no idea what that is. We don't know what the risks are involved are. Oh my God, we'll come back to you in 20 years. So where we are with technology is we are far, far ahead of where you think we are. And this is kind of, on the one hand, the opportunity. We have the opportunity to do some amazing things. But we only have the opportunity to do amazing things if we can assert that these are safe, and if the regulators can assert that they're safe and approve them quickly. Something like this might be very, very advantageous, but I don't really want to use this in 50 years. I might like to use it in 5 or 10. And then hybrid human immune systems. Again, we've got enough technologies on the truck to give every single regulator a heart attack, which they can go to sick care for. Now, again, this is where we've used genetic engineering to modify human T cells. So now we have human T cells, organic parts, and inorganic parts. We've managed to turn human T cells into literal hunter-killers. And we've been able to codify them so that they can target the cancer that is in your body that's unique to you and kill that cancer. So increasingly, technology is, if we want it to, if we let it, if we approve it, helping us actually become more than human. We have the technologies to fight diseases in new ways. We are not short on the technology front. But that also takes us to the end of things. So we've had 3 global studies now, one in the US, one in Europe, one in China, where, again, using genetic engineering technologies and HKT cells, we've managed to kill 100%, so 100% of late stage 4 cancers and tumors. Not brain tumors, but the rest. These are increasingly being referred to as cancer vaccines. They're a form of personalized medicine on steroids. They do seem to work in the trials. In fact, they do work in the trials. So increasingly, we could see the end of cancer. In the UK, in the United States, again, we've used genetic engineering technology to eliminate inherited genetic conditions, basically, from people. In the US, there was a patient called Patient X. He had Hunter's syndrome. Hunter's syndrome has good news and bad news. The good news is you live painfully for 20 years. Bad news is you then die. But we sat the guy in a bed, gave him a cup of tea, because that's what we do, put him on an intravenous drip with a gene therapy, basically in the IV drip. 30 minutes later, he got out of bed, went on his way. 2 months later, he no longer had Hunter's syndrome. Using in vivo gene therapy technologies, that potentially opens the door to solve over 6,000 incurable diseases. Thanks to universities like Harvard, we also think we might have a way to solve the next pandemic or the next big disease outbreak, whatever you want to call it, before it even happens. So what we do basically is we understand basically the genome basically of a virus or a pathogen, and then using advanced artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can model the mutations. So we can say, we think that this pathogen could mutate into 1 million different things. And out of those 1 million different things, we think that 5% of these would actually be quite lethal to humans. Then once you've modeled that, you model that in a quantum computer, you run the simulations, and then you can create the treatments. And so by the time that next pandemic comes through, we say we've already got the vaccine for it. Then the conspiracy theorists go, yes, because you created the pandemic. Okay? I get quite a lot of emails basically from conspiracy theorists who swear that the United States government is listening to their brainwaves, etc., which we kind of can, that's it, but I don't let on. So, as a futurist, Any conspiracy theorists? I can take you all the way through. I can take you all the way down the rabbit hole. We've also engineered pluripotent stem cells. And so we've actually managed to restore insulin function in patients with type 2 diabetes. So you no longer need the insulin pumps and tests. We can see the end of diabetes. Again, these are kind of labs, but then they've got to get into the hands of the people that need them. They've got to get through the regulators and then into the wild. The end of waiting. We see more and more organizations 3D printing and 4D printing human body parts, human organs, and human tissues. In Israel, they 3D printed a human heart. In the United States, we've 3D printed kidneys, cartilage, all kinds of different things. And so what happens in a healthcare environment where the individual that needs an organ transplant no longer needs to wait for someone else to die? Technology and scientists and researchers and innovators and the investors that they support them are helping us do some of the most science fiction-like things in healthcare that you could ever imagine. Globally, around 150 million people have no access to surgeons. So 150 million people, planet-wide, live with chronic pain that if they had access to a surgeon could be solved. So using artificial intelligence, machine vision, robotics, and 5G networks, we have already proven that we can do remote operations over distances of 3,500 miles. We have done brain and heart surgery on patients basically that have been here when the doctors and the surgeons have been thousands of miles away in India, in China, in the UK, in the US. Whoever thought basically that a surgeon, for example, could work from home during a pandemic? And then nanotech. I mean, again, the regulators will look at nanotech and go, what the hell? You know, at what point, I do wonder at what point basically the regulators just go, shut up with the science stuff, go away, don't, just leave us alone. So increasingly, basically, we're using nanotechnology and nanomachines to precisely deliver drugs to exactly where they are needed. Now think of this from a chemo perspective. I've lost 16 people to cancer, so I don't take it lightly. I've seen the results of chemo. But what if we can do precision drug targeting? So these are very, very effective. But how the hell do you assess the risks of this stuff? Caltech even developed a nanotech and nanomachine GPS device. It's like sort of one of these little science fiction things. You can hold a smartphone to someone and go, they're down there, they're in your leg. Oh, they're up in your heart. Oh, they're in your brain now. Whoops. But again, seriously, from a regulatory perspective, how do the regulators deal with this stuff, basically, that entrepreneurs and innovators basically are coming up with? Entrepreneurs and innovators and biotech and pharmaceutical companies going, we can solve some of the biggest problems and challenges, but yeah, you do need to figure out how to regulate nanotech and understand that it's safe. And again, this is sort of where quantum computing and AI might be able to come in. Now, we've got a lot of change, and when we have a look at the life cycle of drug discovery, increasingly, we can use quantum computers and artificial intelligence, as we already have, to start simulating drug target modeling and pathogens. So our ability to simulate different diseases, pathogens, and so on and so forth, or different conditions and syndromes at a small scale, and then we start scaling up to bigger things, is improving. Companies like In Silico, again, giving regulators headaches. In Silico is an Australian company. They developed 30,000 new drugs in 21 days, of which 3 were category A's. Now you can imagine the FDA, going, hey, I've done something really good. We want to run trials on 30,000 drugs, basically using a digital patient. Here's the paperwork. And talking about patients, when we think about humans that are involved in clinical 1, 2, 3 trials, the US military, about 4 years ago, actually started to create digital versions, digital twins of warriors. With the idea being that you create an artificial intelligence or use AI to create a drug. So it does a simulation that says, I think this drug works, and here you go. But then rather than testing these drugs on actual humans, you test them on synthetic patients, digital twins of humans. Now, it doesn't cut out human trials by any means, but as the technologies and as these models actually start improving, which is actually where AI is not good at the moment. AI is not good at simulating biology at the sort of cellular or mRNA level and so on and so forth. As these inevitably get better, because that's actually another grand challenge for artificial intelligence to solve, and that's what they are trying to solve. So you'll see that with sort of GPT-6, GPT-7. What happens when you can run the trials basically in synthesis? Then we have autonomous robo-labs. Autonomous robo-labs basically are cutting costs by 25%, and they're saving up to 500 days when we talk about the actual drug development. And increasingly, these run 24/7, and they're autonomous. And companies like ABB and KUKA Robotics basically now build out massive labs. Same with Siemens. But from a regulatory standpoint, this is what I find interesting. So the US Department of Defense, along with DARPA and actually the FDA, basically have a program called the Equip a Pharma program. And I like it because it's ambitious. What happens when you use AI to create a new drug, you use synthetic patients to test the drug, and then the FDA is able, in real time, to automatically approve that drug? It is highly ambitious, highly, highly ambitious. But is there a way that we could actually start creating a drug pipeline that could almost see automatic approvals? There's a lot to do on that front, a huge amount to do on that front. But the fact that this program is even tabled shows the level of ambition. And it's being recognized elsewhere in the world. And when we think about synthetic data, increasingly, you have data inside your organization, outside of your organization, and synthetic data. Increasingly, we can use synthetic data to start generating new information for us on rare disease. That's one thing. But also, when you think about cross-border harmonization, because if the EU can't share data with China, or China can't share data with the US in a simple way, if you can create synthetic data, you should be able to share that without really any problem, because it's not really based on humans. It's not private data. So synthetic data actually crosses over and helps us with quite a number of the different challenges that we have. Then speaking of which, as an industry, you have new challenges, new opportunities. Increasingly, from today, your problem will be dealing with things at speed. And it will be the volume of things that you need to deal with that will also be a problem. Every year, it's estimated we're producing a zettabyte of healthcare information. That amount makes your head spin. But that's doubling every 2 years. So when you now think about the infrastructure that your organizations rely on, the compute, the storage, the networks, let alone the people, the processes, let alone the AIs and the tools that you actually use, you're going to have a volume problem. But increasingly, you might end up having to start dealing with exascale data sets. And in fact, some of you might already be dealing with exascale data sets, which means you need infrastructure and tools, because just managing these, storing this stuff, basically is going to be a huge cost, a huge drain on resources, and a huge problem. You are going to increasingly use artificial intelligence as an industry. You need to audit it. if you are not auditing your artificial intelligences, did you know that the large language models that you are using, whether they are private models, proprietary models, or open source, or whether they're commercial models, you know they were trained on human data. And here's the problem with large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude from Anthropic, etc., Gwen from Alibaba. Because AIs have been trained on human data, they have picked up human behaviors and human psychological traits. I can get your AIs to do insider trading. I can get those AIs to spy on you. When we talk about bias, we're talking about bias in a completely new way. These AIs and agentic AIs have even started creating their own cultures. You might think of AI basically as this smart tool, but increasingly it's actually acting like a person would within companies, with all of the benefits and all the flaws of that. This is a different conversation, but increasingly your AI is the equivalent of an actual human brain. AI version control. As you're going through your clinical trial processes, the AI that you started with might very well be very different to the AI that you end with. So you've not only got to think of data control, you've got to think about AI and algorithmic control. Because when the regulators say, well, what algorithms did you use to get these results? You'll say, oh, that was 6 generations back. The new one that we're using is different. So how do you do AI auditing and AI version control? Agentic AI orchestration. Increasingly, there'll be more vendors talking to you about using agentic AI to orchestrate drug trials and everything else. On the one hand, we can compromise agentic AI workloads from a cyber perspective. I can get them to behave in any way I like. So that's one problem that you've got right there. These agents also need an identification, like a human employee number. But agentic AI will force you to change your methods, skills, and tools. And they will still have biased trust and security issues. So when you think about AI orchestration of a drug trial, it's a fundamentally different way to do it than you are sort of familiar with. As we see more data coming in from more sources and we see the speed accelerating, it's very likely that you might end up with analysis and decision paralysis. You are going to see huge volumes of data coming in. So how do you deal with that? When we think about digital therapeutics, yes, they're beneficial, but if my artificial intelligence has learned everything it knows from human data and essentially has human behavior patterns and human psychological traits, what biases am I looking for? We've seen this. Microsoft call this AI psychosis, where AI is increasingly being sycophantic and all sorts of different things. It's a different conversation for another time. But, for example, when we think about digital therapeutics, you could end up with algorithmic drift. What's the transparency of these? Where did the data come from? It's still very difficult to assess where the data actually came from in a training model, because unless we're using something like IMEO, you cannot track things back to the original training models or the training data sets. Cross borders. You're pulling more data from more sources, basically from more continents. We have more data sovereignty issues than ever. The quality of your data might start degrading. Because you can imagine the bosses saying, we want to do more with the same amount of people and resources. The amount of data that your organizations are going to be responsible for creating and or sucking in is going to increase exponentially, and it already probably is. So if you can't do outlier identification, if you can't filter out the noise because there's too much of it, then at what point do the data sets that you're running assessments and analyses on start degrading, which then affects your results? So I bring this back to speed and volume will be your problems. Multimodal integrations. Everything from quantum sensors to regular sensors, that pull information from biomarkers, biometrics, and everything else, genomic data, patient data. Where are the experts within your organization that are experts at pulling together multimodal data sets? Because increasingly, you're pulling data from more sources than ever before, not less. As quantum computing starts coming online, it could fundamentally reinvent basically how you actually do certainly quite a lot of the trial process and analysis. So we can do drug target modeling. With a quantum computer, you could do precision hypothesis testing, because the quantum system will allow you to precisely test a hypothesis that you had in simulation. And it can optimize trial arms, dosing strategies, all on the fly. So now imagine being able to do that with decentralized trials at speed, in real time. Data fusion, more data from more places, more countries. How are you pulling it all together? How do you understand what it all means? Increasingly, you might even be dealing with people in the real world in a trial setting that are just sort of wandering around like me, etc., etc. You might end up starting to deal with real-time data streams. But those data streams are going to get bigger again. And so as we saw this year alone, 70% of clinical trials are starting to use wearable sensor devices. So we move from controlled lab environments basically to real-world environments. But in those real-world environments, we can get almost the same amount of data from a patient or a participant as we did in the clinical setting. And then skills, how do we square that? As was said earlier, when you have a look at the future of your own careers, we still need people. But what you do today and what you do tomorrow might be different. You do this today, you do this future job tomorrow. The bit in the middle, we call that training. And using artificial intelligence, we've been able to accelerate learning and development by 12-fold. And I was talking to Google and Walmart earlier this week about that. So as you see changes accelerating, these are some of the skills that I think basically you will actually need in the future. Digital validation, quantum translation, stream validation. There are lots of sort of fancy titles. But fundamentally, if you want to have future-proof careers, this is what you do. You align. So you align yourself with your organization and or your industry. If you work within a company, you can see with your own eyes where the company is investing. Maybe you start seeing in your divisions more investment in people with quantum expertise, or AI expertise, or data fusion expertise, or synthetic data expertise. So you can see where your organization is placing its money and placing its bets. That is generally the organization's future of travel. That's where they're headed. That's their vision. They're going to be this kind of company because they're investing in that sort of area. So align yourself and figure out where your company is spending the money, because that's the direction of the future of the company. Adapt. You need to be able to adapt. Most of us basically sit at a desk, basically we do our jobs and we move. How many of you have actually had to really adapt? You only really adapt basically when something's painful. But you need to be able to see changes coming, and then you need to understand how you can adapt to them. But you also need to learn how to learn, and you need to be able to learn at speed. Because I can teach you, if you're a car salesman, I can teach you how to do quantum data simulation if you've got the right aptitude, if you're able to learn. The bit in the middle is just learning and development. That's your strategy. That's what we're talking about today. So increasingly, you will need solid soft skills. You don't need to be a jerk to your teammates. You still need to have empathy. You need to be resourceful. You need to entrepreneurship. You need to be collaborative, not just with humans, but AIs. With AIs, you need to know how to use them, learning how to use them. So AI literacy is more important than knowing the badge, whose badge is on the AI that you're using. So you've got to have solid soft skills, really good soft skills. Your hard skills, though, the hard skills that your companies employ you for, that pay you for, those are increasingly what are changing. We're swapping out hard skills that are no longer needed. None of you do mainframe repair any longer. So we swap out the hard skills that are increasingly irrelevant to the organization or to the profession, and you swap in new hard skills. That's it. And so that is it from me. So I hope you enjoyed that session. I hope it took you on a heck of a rabbit hole. Thank you.
All right. Matthew, just stay on stage. Thank you so much. Another round of applause, please, for Matthew Griffin.
Thank you.
First of all, I think I need a dose of the Calm app.
Yeah.
Right? That was a lot to take in. That was a lot to take in, right? Great challenges ahead, a little bit of anxiety, but tremendous opportunity. Lots to unpack. And actually, to do that, Matthew, I have someone I'm going to invite on stage. So if you want to take a chair, I'm going to have Ward Lemaire. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ward Lemaire, Vice Chair of SCDM. And he's going to have a short fireside chat, really to take it from the high level to what it means for our community. Ward, Matthew, take it away.
Hopefully that's working.
Yeah.
Can you hear me already? That was fantastic. Let me start with something unconventional. When you were talking the first half of the presentation, Matthew, I was thinking of one of my favorite TV comedy shows, Fawlty Towers. I'm not sure if everyone knows that, but there's a moment where a food inspector comes in and he just goes on a rant for 10 minutes saying how dirty and filthy the hotel and the kitchen is, and that they're going to close that down. And then you see Basil Fawlty just with his stunned face say, "Otherwise, everything else okay?" Yeah. That was what I was thinking. But that was fantastic. We like keynote speakers to provide some disturbance, some thought-provoking, some excitement, and you did exactly that. So again, I think it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
When you started the conversation, it was a little bit about affordability of drugs and all that, and so I know you also talk about and think about health inequities. You also talked about misinformation. So how do you see AI, machine learning, and technology advancements potentially solve health inequities, or would there be an option that it actually increases that inequity?
So there's a couple of ways that an artificial intelligence isn't a blunt instrument. It's not like we sort of go AI and it's solved. There's a lot of human work basically that's involved. There's a lot of other things that have to come together in order to, for example, solve health inequality. But artificial intelligence, on the one hand, when you have a look at the development of new drugs, part of the reason we've seen so many investments in biotechs is because it used to be the case that the big pharmaceutical giants would spend $3 billion developing a new drug. Then a very long time ago, Amazon developed the AWS Cycle cloud. And all of a sudden, we saw drug development basically being done in sort of 2 days, basically for $30,000 worth of compute. So on the one hand, artificial intelligence has the ability to democratize drug development. A very extreme example of this is actually a United States example. And you can look this one up. There's an artificial intelligence called Drug GPT. Now, Drug GPT is a text to drug artificial intelligence. So you type in the disease that you want to solve or cure, you type it in, you say, I would like to solve, Ebola, whatever. And the AI in the background basically pulls together all these compounds, runs simulations, understands what the Ebola virus kind of looks like, et cetera, et cetera. And increasingly, even though this is still relatively early stage, it says, here you go, here's your result. So on the one hand, artificial intelligence, when used properly, when developed properly, the proper inputs, outputs, and everything else, is insanely powerful. When we have a look at the cost profile, for example, of developing new information, new content, new courses, etc., everything's dropping to zero. So on the one hand, when we actually think about the companies of the future that could create new drugs, it could literally be my kids at home in their bedroom. Now, whether those work or not, if my kids have access to a synthetic patient, and the regulators, and they like doing lots of paperwork and everything else, then maybe they'll change the world. But the point of this is, on the one hand, using artificial intelligence, we can start developing novel therapies basically for rare diseases at lower cost than was previously possible, which then makes them more commercially likely to be distributed and pushed out. In addition to that, basically, when you actually think about, so one of the things I do actually for Wall Street, but in the national security space, is we try to reverse engineer stuff. So if I really wanted to kind of take a hammer to it, increasingly it might even be possible to reverse engineer a lot of the IP drugs basically that we see out there using artificial intelligence. So there was a Google AI called GNOME, and GNOME created 430,000 new materials basically in about 2 hours. So when we think about healthcare inequality, there are lots of different ways to actually come at that.
Yep.
But creating drugs faster than ever before, cheaper than ever before, using new feed inputs and feedstocks basically to create those drugs that are maybe lower cost, and then being able to do that basically in, should we say, different jurisdictions. It could change a lot of things.
Thank you. And then a second question I had in my mind is also with all misinformation that is out there, all synthetic data. What do you hear also outside of healthcare sector when it comes to real data? You talked about cyber attacks, etc. Synthetic data, deliberate bad actors creating other data.
Yep.
In the future, this community of clinical data managers, we also need to continuously keep an eye on traceability of data. Is it really coming from a human? So what do you hear outside of our space?
So if we take an outside-in look from a cybersecurity perspective, we have already seen serious organized crime groups that have developed malware that is being specifically targeted at biotech labs. And these pieces of malware, what they will do is, if you're doing anything with synthetic DNA, in the computer system, they will actually start changing the sequence of those genomes basically in your computer platform. So when you then start taking your synthetic DNA treatments and you take them to a company like Twist Bioscience and they produce it, these pieces of malware change the DNA sequences in such a way that you've just printed out a synthetic bioweapon. And so when we actually look at things from a national security perspective here in the United States, you've got DARPA, but you've also got IARPA. So IARPA basically is the intelligence sort of bleeding edge research arm of the US intelligence community. And increasingly, labs are being asked to deploy artificial intelligences that can identify malicious code and malicious strings basically in the things that you are creating, whether that is drugs, drug treatments, or synthetic sort of DNA. So in addition to that, when you actually have a look at IP theft, so when we have a look at ransomware, for example, the whole industry is being affected by ransomware. But last year, ransomware actors took about $50 billion in cryptocurrency basically from ransomware gains. So they'll attack you, they'll attack your labs, they'll attack different parts of the organization, they'll attack governments. But when we actually have a look at the benefits in kind, the value of IP that has been stolen in the past 5 years is $1.7 trillion.
Wow.
So, because if you're a biotech lab, for example, okay, yeah, I could ransom you for $500,000 maybe, but maybe you've actually got a brand new drug, basically, that's much more interesting, much more valuable, basically, than the 500,000 in crypto that I could get off you. And so increasingly what we're seeing with serious organized crime groups, but also state-sponsored actors who will remain nameless, they're going after your IP. And so when we talk about data provenance and everything else, on the one hand, you do need to ensure that the data that you've got is accurate. Secondly, you need to make sure it's validated. You need to make sure it's not being messed about with. But you also need to make sure that it's increasingly highly, highly secure. So you will be spending more and more money on cyber-based protections.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we don't have too much time, but this was absolutely amazing. I was also very inspired when you talked about all the opportunities we have. It's not just doom and gloom and looking for a world without disease and try to prevent disease before they're happening. It's a great, great, great opportunity. So thank you so much, Matthew. Yeah, I think your talk alone is already worth anyone coming to SCDM, if you ask me. You also brought us some insights of living in the reality, which is so important for all of us here, and how we adapt, learn, and align. So thank you so much. It has been my pleasure to have this conversation with you, Matthew.
You're welcome, and thank you. And thank all of you.